Control of information is the single most powerful tool any elite leader can wield, and it's often invisible to those it affects. At its core, controlling information isn't about suppressing everything or locking people away. It's about curating reality, shaping perception, and deciding what people see, hear, and focus on. Humans naturally rely on information to make decisions, form opinions, and understand the world around them. If someone else can subtly manipulate the input of that information, they are effectively shaping your thoughts, choices, and even your identity without you realizing it. This is the secret weapon of the elite, and it works in ways that are both overt and almost entirely invisible, blending seamlessly into everyday life. Consider how news cycles work. Stories are not just reported, they are selected, framed, and emphasized to provoke specific reactions. A single event can be presented as a crisis, a tragedy, or a triumph depending on what the storyteller wants you to feel. Even in social media, where information seems abundant, control still exists. Algorithms decide what appears on your feed, which posts you see, and which perspectives are buried. This is not random, it is a sophisticated form of information curation that guides attention towards certain ideas and away from others. When you're exposed to the same narratives repeatedly, you start internalizing them. Your opinions, fears, and desires slowly align with what has been strategically highlighted. The psychological impact of controlling information cannot be overstated. Humans are not rational processors of facts. We are emotional beings, heavily influenced by context, framing, and repetition. The elite understand this. By controlling what you see, they control what you think is important, what you worry about, and even what you desire. For example, if a society is constantly exposed to fear-based messaging, crime rates rising, economic collapse, threats from outsiders, people start making decisions out of anxiety and urgency rather than rational analysis. Conversely, highlighting success stories or opportunities can drive aspiration, compliance, or admiration toward those who are shaping the narrative. In both cases, the individual's perception is molded without them ever consciously realizing it. This control is further reinforced by exclusion. What isn't shown can be as powerful as what is. By keeping certain perspectives, facts, or experiences hidden, elites create a filtered version of reality, where people believe they understand the world while only seeing a narrow slice of it. This is a subtle form of cognitive manipulation because the human brain tends to fill gaps in knowledge with assumptions based on what is presented. If you only see certain pieces of the puzzle, your mind will construct the rest, often in ways that align perfectly with the agenda of those controlling the information. In this sense, control is not just about telling people what to think, it's about telling them what to see and letting their own minds do the rest, which makes the manipulation feel entirely natural and self-directed. Historically, controlling information has always been a cornerstone of power. Ancient empires controlled written records, religious texts, and public proclamations. Monarchs carefully curated what stories circulated in the court, which messengers delivered news, and what knowledge the public could access. Today, the methods are more technologically advanced, but the principle remains the same. Elite leaders, corporations, and governments have access to tools that allow them to filter, amplify, or distort information at scale. Mass media, advertising, social media algorithms, and educational content all serve as instruments for subtly shaping public perception. Each headline, video, or trending topic is not just content, it is a strategic push in a specific direction, engineered to influence beliefs and behaviors. What makes this tactic particularly insidious is that it leverages the human tendency to trust authority and sources. Most people do not critically evaluate every piece of information they encounter. Instead, they rely on heuristics, mental shortcuts, to judge reliability. When information comes from sources perceived as legitimate, whether it's a news outlet, a social media influencer, or an educational platform, it is often accepted without deep scrutiny. Elite controllers exploit this. By carefully positioning themselves or their proxies as trustworthy sources, they can deliver narratives that guide public thought while giving the impression of independent reasoning. In other words, people feel they are arriving at conclusions themselves, while in reality, those conclusions have been guided, nudged, and manipulated from the outside. Control over information also extends to timing and framing. It's not just what you are shown, but when and how you see it. Timing can create urgency, fear, or desire. A story released at the right moment can dominate attention, while conflicting information released too early or too late is ignored. Framing shapes interpretation. The same event can be framed as a victory, a threat, or a moral imperative. By carefully controlling both the timing and context of information, elite leaders shape how people perceive reality and respond emotionally. This is why certain political, economic, or social events are so carefully choreographed in modern society, and why media often seems to converge on similar narratives across multiple channels. Another critical aspect of information control is repetition and reinforcement. When a message is repeated, the brain begins to accept it as truth. This is called the illusory truth effect, and it is a psychological mechanism the elite exploit regularly. By consistently presenting certain ideas, values, or fears, they embed them deep into the collective consciousness. The more people hear the same narrative, the less they question it, and the more it influences decisions, opinions, and even identity. Over time, repeated exposure doesn't just influence individual choices. It creates societal norms, reinforcing compliance and shaping collective behavior. Social proof is also a component of controlling information. When elite figures curate what seems popular, they guide what people perceive as normal or acceptable. Humans are wired to follow others. Social conformity is a powerful driver of behavior. By highlighting certain trends, ideas, or behaviors as mainstream, elites manipulate what people believe is widely accepted, effectively herding collective thought. This herd mentality amplifies their control as individuals align their beliefs and actions to match the perceived consensus, often without ever realizing the consensus itself is manufactured. Finally, control of information isn't limited to external narratives. It extends to self-perception and personal reality. The elite understand that shaping how individuals perceive themselves is as crucial as shaping how they perceive the world. By controlling the inputs, what people read, see, or are exposed to, they can influence self-doubt, confidence, ambition, and even morality. For example, if you are repeatedly exposed to messaging that emphasizes inadequacy or scarcity, your decisions may become defensive and risk-averse. Conversely, exposure to aspirational messaging framed around specific models of success can drive compliance with elite-driven societal structures. In both cases, the individual's mental landscape is sculpted subtly and systematically, creating a pliable mind that aligns with the interests of those controlling the information. In essence, control of information is not about overt manipulation, it is about subtle orchestration. It works because it taps into natural human tendencies: trust, attention, emotion, repetition, and conformity. Elite leaders understand that if they can filter, frame, and time information, they can shape perception, influence decisions, and guide entire populations without ever forcing anyone to act. The power lies in invisibility, in the illusion of freedom, and in the careful curation of reality, so that people believe they are acting independently while their choices have been strategically guided from the shadows. Creating emotional triggers is one of the most subtle and effective ways elite leaders manipulate people. Unlike force or intimidation, which is obvious and often resisted, emotional triggers operate beneath the surface. They tap directly into the human brain's most primal systems, guiding decisions and behaviors without rational thought. Emotions are faster than logic. They are the first layer of human response, shaping perception and action before reason ever has a chance to intervene. Elite leaders understand this perfectly. They know that by eliciting specific emotional reactions, they can control behavior, influence choices, and steer entire populations while remaining almost invisible in their manipulation. At its core, creating emotional triggers is about identifying the psychological levers that drive behavior and using them deliberately. Fear is one of the most powerful triggers. It activates the amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for threat detection, bypassing the rational frontal cortex. When people are afraid, they make choices for safety, security, or avoidance, often ignoring logic or long-term consequences. Elite leaders exploit fear by emphasizing threats, whether real, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, so people comply, follow rules, or accept narratives they might otherwise question. This is why societies exposed to constant crisis messaging or fear-driven media tend to behave predictably. Fear narrows focus, reduces critical thinking, and encourages reliance on authority for guidance. But fear is just one piece of the puzzle. Desire, hope, and ambition are equally powerful triggers. Humans are motivated by what they want as much as by what they fear. Elite leaders often present visions of success, opportunity, or social approval that align with their goals. By making these outcomes seem attainable but contingent on specific behaviors, buying a product, supporting a policy, or following a leader, they subtly channel desire into compliance. The emotional appeal is key. People are not just persuaded by facts, they are drawn by the feeling of possibility, the thrill of achievement, or the hope of recognition. These emotional triggers create an invisible leash, guiding actions while making people believe they are acting out of free will or personal ambition. Repetition amplifies emotional triggers. When certain feelings are consistently associated with a message, product, or leader, the brain begins to respond automatically. Think of advertising jingles, political slogans, or viral content that elicits strong reactions. Over time, the emotional association becomes conditioned, almost reflexive. For example, repeated exposure to messages of scarcity or loss, limited time, while supplies last, now, creates anxiety that drives immediate action. Elite leaders understand this principle intuitively. They use repeated emotional cues to ensure that when an individual encounters a stimulus, the desired reaction occurs almost automatically, bypassing conscious reasoning. Social dynamics are another critical layer. Emotional triggers are often more effective when people see others reacting emotionally in predictable ways. Social proof amplifies the effect of these triggers. If a population collectively responds with fear, outrage, or excitement, individuals are more likely to mirror these emotions, even without fully understanding why. Elite leaders harness this through controlled narratives, media amplification, or selective visibility of reactions. By showing a carefully curated emotional landscape, they manipulate not just individual feelings, but the emotional climate of entire groups, creating a feedback loop where emotion spreads and reinforces itself. The most powerful emotional triggers are often those tied to identity and belonging. Humans crave connection, approval, and social inclusion. By creating situations where emotions are linked to group identity, fear of exclusion, pride in loyalty, shame for dissent, elite leaders tap into deeply rooted psychological drives. People will go to great lengths to conform emotionally when they feel their place in a group is at stake. The elite exploit this by crafting narratives that link emotion to social position, morality, or loyalty. Subtle cues, repeated messaging, and selective emphasis on values or norms ensure that people internalize the desired emotional state as part of who they are, making resistance psychologically uncomfortable or even painful. Emotional triggers also work by creating contrast, highlighting extreme states, danger versus safety, poverty versus wealth, failure versus success, intensifies reactions and makes people more likely to respond predictably. The brain is wired to notice differences and respond to extremes, so elite leaders design environments and narratives that exaggerate contrasts. This makes emotional reactions sharper and more immediate, increasing the likelihood that people will act in ways that align with the intended outcome. Importantly, these triggers are rarely obvious. Most people believe they are making decisions based on logic, facts, or personal choice, while in reality their actions are guided by subtle emotional nudges. Emotional triggers bypass rational scrutiny because emotions feel authentic. They originate from within, not from an external source. This is why elite manipulation is so effective. It doesn't feel like manipulation at all. By understanding the core emotional drivers of human behavior, elite leaders can orchestrate entire society's actions without overt coercion, relying instead on the automatic, visceral responses of the human brain. The danger and the brilliance of emotional triggers lies in their invisibility. They work continuously, shaping thoughts, decisions, and behaviors without conscious awareness. People often realize only after the fact that their actions were influenced or guided in ways they hadn't consciously chosen. Awareness is the only defense. Recognizing that fear, desire, hope, and social pressure can be engineered by those with knowledge and intent is the first step in reclaiming personal autonomy and resisting subtle manipulation. Subtle conditioning is one of the most insidious tools elite leaders use to shape behavior, perception, and thought without ever appearing coercive. Unlike overt commands or obvious manipulation, subtle conditioning works quietly, almost invisibly, embedding patterns of behavior and belief directly into the subconscious mind over time. It leverages the brain's natural tendencies toward habit formation, repetition, and associative learning. Humans are creatures of routine and pattern recognition. We unconsciously respond to repeated stimuli and associations, often without realizing why we behave the way we do. Elite leaders understand this deeply. By carefully designing environments, messages, and experiences, they can condition populations to respond predictably, ensuring compliance, loyalty, or belief systems without direct confrontation or force. At its core, subtle conditioning relies on the principle of repetition and association. When certain actions, words, or symbols are consistently paired with emotional reactions, positive or negative, the brain begins to form automatic responses. For example, if a leader consistently associates loyalty with rewards such as praise, recognition, or advancement, people begin to internalize the connection. The act of being loyal becomes intrinsically linked to a sense of gain, even when no explicit rule enforces it. Conversely, repeated association of dissent or questioning with negative outcomes, disapproval, exclusion, or failure, creates a natural aversion. Over time, individuals start regulating their own behavior to avoid these consequences, effectively self-policing in alignment with the elite's agenda. The power of this method is that it eliminates the need for overt enforcement. People become complicit in their own manipulation without conscious awareness. Subtle conditioning also exploits the human brain's reward system. Neuroscience shows that behaviors followed by positive reinforcement release dopamine, creating a pleasurable feedback loop. Elite leaders design conditions where compliance, conformity, or alignment with certain ideals triggers these rewards. Even minor reinforcements, a compliment, recognition in a social setting, or a sense of belonging, can be enough to establish deeply ingrained habits. Once the behavior is repeated enough, it transitions from a conscious choice to an automatic response. The brain, conditioned over time, reacts instinctively to stimuli without engaging in rational evaluation. This is why large populations can adopt behaviors or ideologies that they might have rejected if presented suddenly or forcefully. Timing is a crucial element of subtle conditioning. The most effective conditioning occurs gradually, over an extended period. Humans are far less likely to resist or recognize manipulation when changes are incremental and consistent rather than sudden and extreme. For example, exposure to certain narratives, social norms, or cultural cues repeated over weeks, months, or years embeds them in the collective consciousness. Individuals adopt these patterns as their own beliefs because the change feels natural and self-directed. Elite leaders leverage this by shaping education, media, and social institutions, creating incremental shifts in perception and behavior that align society with their objectives without triggering resistance or awareness. Another critical aspect of subtle conditioning is contextual and environmental control. The elite don't just manipulate messages, they craft entire environments that reinforce desired behaviors. This can include social structures, economic incentives, cultural norms, and even physical spaces that subtly guide choices. For example, positioning certain products, ideas, or authorities as ubiquitous reinforces the perception that they are normal, desirable, or inevitable. Similarly, controlling access to alternatives, information, or counter-narratives ensures that the conditioned responses remain unchallenged. By creating an environment where conditioned behaviors are continuously reinforced, elite leaders amplify the subconscious influence on thought and action, making compliance habitual and resistance psychologically difficult. Social proof and peer influence amplify subtle conditioning. Humans are inherently social beings, and behavior is strongly shaped by observation. When conditioned patterns are displayed publicly, through role models, leaders, or media representations, they signal what is acceptable, desirable, or rewarded. Others unconsciously adopt these behaviors to gain approval, avoid disapproval, or align with perceived social norms. The elite exploit this by ensuring that conditioned behaviors are visible, normalized, and repeated across influential social channels. Over time, These behaviors become entrenched as societal expectations, further embedding the conditioned responses within the collective psyche. Subtle conditioning also manipulates perception of choice. People feel autonomy even when their options are carefully curated to produce predictable outcomes. By presenting a controlled range of alternatives, the elite create the illusion of free will while guiding behavior in a predetermined direction. This tactic is profoundly effective because it reduces resistance. People are far more likely to follow patterns they believe they chose themselves. The combination of reinforcement, repetition, and controlled options ensures that conditioned responses are deeply internalized, appearing as natural behavior rather than manipulation. This is why certain ideologies, consumer habits, or societal norms feel innate. They have been conditioned over time to feel like self-directed choices. One of the most dangerous aspects of subtle conditioning is that it operates beneath conscious awareness. People rarely recognize the forces shaping their responses because the process exploits automatic cognitive pathways. Behaviors become habitual, reactions predictable, and belief systems rigid, all without the individual realizing they are being guided. This invisibility is what makes subtle conditioning so powerful and so aligned with the strategies of elite leaders. By leveraging the brain's natural tendencies toward pattern recognition, reinforcement, and habit formation, elites can shape entire populations in ways that appear organic, inevitable, and self-directed. Ultimately, subtle conditioning works because it blends psychological principles with social, cultural, and environmental cues. It is invisible yet pervasive, gradual yet effective, and personal yet universal. It creates a population that behaves, believes, and reacts in ways aligned with elite objectives, not through coercion or force, but through carefully orchestrated patterns of association, reinforcement, and normalization. Those who understand this principle can begin to see the invisible chains guiding behavior around them, recognizing where conditioning has shaped thought, and reclaiming autonomy over their decisions and perceptions. Invisible hierarchies are one of the most subtle yet powerful tools that elite leaders use to control individuals and entire societies. Unlike formal hierarchies, which are obvious and enforceable through rules, titles, or positions, invisible hierarchies operate beneath awareness, shaping behavior through perceived status, social cues, and implicit power structures. These hierarchies rely on the human brain's natural tendency to recognize patterns of authority and social rank, often without conscious thought. From childhood, humans are wired to detect leaders, gauge influence, and adjust behavior according to perceived social order. Elite leaders exploit this instinctive tendency, creating systems where individuals regulate themselves based on invisible power dynamics rather than explicit commands, allowing control to operate silently, efficiently, and pervasively. At its core, invisible hierarchies are about perception. People often behave in ways dictated not by laws or rules, but by what they perceive to be the unspoken structure of influence around them. Who matters? Who decides? Who holds sway? These questions are not always answered openly, but the answers guide behavior powerfully. Leaders and elites intentionally shape these perceptions by signaling influence through selective visibility, symbolic authority, and controlled interactions. By doing so, they create an ecosystem where people unconsciously defer to certain figures, follow certain trends, or align with specific groups, all without realizing they are operating under an invisible chain of command. The power of invisible hierarchies lies in the fact that they eliminate resistance. When authority is obvious and forceful, it invites rebellion, questioning, and scrutiny. Invisible hierarchies, by contrast, operate subtly, embedding obedience into social perception and behavior. People often self-regulate because they want to fit into the perceived order, gain approval, or avoid social exclusion. This is why workplaces, institutions, and even online communities often exhibit rigid patterns of compliance and conformity without the need for explicit enforcement. The elite understand that when individuals internalize hierarchical expectations, they become collaborators in their own subordination, enforcing the system simply by following it. One of the key mechanisms of invisible hierarchies is symbolic signaling. Symbols, gestures, and subtle cues communicate power without words. The way someone dresses, speaks, or is presented in public can indicate rank and authority, triggering automatic behavioral adjustments in observers. Humans are primed to respond to these signals because they evolved in hierarchical social groups, where misreading rank could carry serious consequences. Elite leaders exploit this evolutionary wiring by designing environments where visual, auditory, and social cues constantly reinforce their authority. Over time, repeated exposure to these signals creates a mental model of the hierarchy in which people naturally defer to those at the top, even when the hierarchy itself is unspoken or invisible. Another critical aspect is the manipulation of access and visibility. Elites control who gets to see or interact with them, and who remains on the periphery. This selective exposure communicates implicit status, suggesting who is in and who is out. People naturally strive to climb these invisible ladders or maintain their position within them. The knowledge that some individuals hold access to power or information that others do not creates a self-reinforcing system where behavior aligns with the perceived hierarchy. People begin to regulate their own actions, speech, and choices to align with expectations set by the elite, often without ever being told explicitly what to do. Invisible hierarchies also exploit the human desire for social validation and belonging. People want to belong to higher status groups, be recognized by influential figures, and avoid the shame or marginalization associated with low status. Elite leaders use this to manipulate loyalty, compliance, and behavior by constructing tiers of influence, reward, and recognition that are not openly codified, but are socially understood. Leaders create a system where people compete for approval and unconsciously conform to the behaviors and norms dictated by those at the top. Emotional triggers such as fear of exclusion, pride in belonging, and envy of higher status peers intensify this effect, making invisible hierarchies self-sustaining and psychologically potent. Social proof magnifies the effect of invisible hierarchies. People look to others for cues on how to behave, especially in complex or ambiguous situations. When influential individuals follow certain behaviors, endorse particular ideas, or exhibit specific emotional responses, others emulate them. Elite leaders understand this instinctively, positioning carefully chosen figures in visible roles to guide collective behavior. Through subtle orchestration, they create the perception that the hierarchy is natural, inevitable, and unquestionable. Over time, this shapes cultural norms, expectations, and even moral judgments, embedding the hierarchy deeply into collective consciousness. Timing and repetition are also critical. Invisible hierarchies are not established overnight, they are cultivated over months or years. Each interaction, message, and visible signal reinforces the mental map of who holds influence. Small, consistent cues, who speaks first, who is deferred to, whose opinions dominate, gradually cement the hierarchy in the minds of those observing. People internalize this structure, and it governs behavior automatically. The beauty of invisible hierarchies is that compliance becomes self-enforcing. Individuals monitor themselves and each other, policing behavior in alignment with the unspoken order. What makes invisible hierarchies so effective is that they feel natural. Unlike overt rules or force, they operate within the brain's instinctive, social frameworks. People rarely recognize the invisible chains guiding their actions because the hierarchy exploits deeply ingrained cognitive shortcuts for processing authority and influence. Decisions that appear voluntary or independent are often shaped by layers of subtle cues, emotional reinforcement, and social pressures strategically orchestrated by those at the top. Elite leaders know that if people perceive the hierarchy as organic rather than imposed, it becomes far more durable, pervasive, and resistant to challenge. In essence, invisible hierarchies allow elites to maintain control without ever issuing commands. By shaping perception, signaling authority, controlling access, exploiting social instincts, and reinforcing patterns through repetition, they create a system where obedience, compliance, and conformity emerge naturally. People become self-regulating agents, internalizing the hierarchy, enforcing it on themselves, and even perpetuating it among peers. It is a method of control that is both subtle and absolute, operating beneath awareness, yet determining behavior, beliefs, and social dynamics with precision and efficiency. The illusion of choice is one of the most subtle and effective strategies elite leaders use to control people while maintaining the appearance of freedom. Unlike overt coercion, which triggers resistance or defiance. The illusion of choice operates by giving the perception of freedom while steering decisions in a predetermined direction. Humans are naturally wired to value autonomy and agency. When we feel we are making our own decisions, our brains release dopamine and other reward chemicals, creating a sense of satisfaction and control. Elite leaders exploit this instinct by carefully designing environments, options, and circumstances so that individuals believe they are choosing freely, when in reality, every option leads to outcomes that serve the agendas of those in power. This method is both invisible and profoundly effective because it bypasses rational scrutiny, allowing control to operate under the guise of personal empowerment. At its core, the illusion of choice relies on curating the available options. People rarely consider every possible alternative. They respond to the range of options presented to them. By limiting these options, shaping their presentation, or framing them strategically, elite leaders guide decision-making while leaving the individual convinced they exercised free will. For example, a consumer might think they are selecting a product based on personal preference, but all choices are designed to generate profit or steer behavior. Similarly, voters might believe they are making independent political decisions, yet the framing of the candidates, the emphasis on particular issues, and the visibility of narratives guide the outcome toward predetermined objectives. In both cases, the perception of choice is maintained while outcomes remain under control. Psychologically, the illusion of choice works because humans value the feeling of autonomy even more than the actual freedom to act. When people feel that a decision is theirs, they are more likely to accept it and internalize the outcome as self-directed. This effect is leveraged by elite leaders across social, political, and economic domains. By presenting choices that align with their objectives, they create a sense of empowerment while subtly shaping the behavior, opinions, and beliefs of the population. The more people believe they are acting independently, the less they question the underlying system or attempt to resist manipulation, making control more efficient and durable. Framing and context play critical roles in the illusion of choice. Two options may appear distinct, but the way they are presented can influence perception and preference dramatically. For example, emphasizing the benefits of one option while downplaying the drawbacks of another creates an emotional bias that guides selection. Elite leaders and marketers alike use this technique to steer decisions subtly. Even small shifts in language, visual cues, or timing can make a particular choice feel more appealing, desirable, or inevitable. The brain interprets these cues unconsciously, reinforcing the perception of personal agency while remaining guided by external influence. Another layer of the illusion of choice involves reinforcing social and cultural norms. People often make decisions not just based on individual preference but on what they believe is acceptable, popular, or expected. Elite leaders manipulate these perceptions by showcasing behaviors, beliefs, or actions as mainstream or desirable. When individuals select from options that appear widely accepted, they feel they are exercising choice, while in reality, the social context has been carefully engineered to favor predictable outcomes. Social proof amplifies the illusion. When everyone else seems to favor a particular path, the decision feels personal and voluntary, yet it is subtly guided by the invisible hand of influence. Repetition is also a key factor. When the same set of options is presented repeatedly, the brain begins to accept them as natural or inevitable. This conditioning reinforces the illusion that choices are authentic and self-directed. Over time, people internalize these patterns, developing habits and preferences that align with the intended outcomes. The elite use this principle not only in consumer behavior or political decision-making but also in shaping ideologies, social attitudes, and cultural norms. By repeatedly structuring choices in specific ways, they embed long-term influence while maintaining the appearance of freedom. Emotional triggers further enhance the illusion of choice. By linking options to feelings of fear, desire, pride, or belonging, elites guide decisions while reinforcing the sense of autonomy. People believe they are acting according to personal values or goals, yet their choices are influenced by emotional cues deliberately engineered to favor certain outcomes. Fear of missing out, the promise of reward, or the need for social approval can make one option feel like the obvious right choice, even though the range of choices itself was controlled. The emotional engagement deepens the perception of agency while ensuring behavior aligns with the intended path. The illusion of choice is particularly effective because it avoids resistance and rebellion. When people believe they are deciding for themselves, they are more committed to the outcome, less likely to question it, and less likely to resist manipulation. This makes control sustainable, as compliance appears voluntary rather than coerced. In contrast, overt manipulation often provokes skepticism, defiance, or psychological resistance. By hiding control behind a veil of freedom, elite leaders achieve far greater influence over behavior, opinions, and beliefs than force or authority alone could accomplish. Ultimately, the illusion of choice works because it exploits the human brain's deep desire for autonomy while guiding behavior along paths predetermined by those in power. People make decisions, form beliefs, and adopt behaviors with the confidence that they are self-directed, while the options, framing, timing, and emotional cues have been strategically designed to produce specific outcomes. This method is invisible, powerful, and psychologically sophisticated, allowing elite leaders to maintain influence and control across societies, markets, and cultures without ever appearing to do so. Remember, freedom is often an illusion, and power doesn't demand your obedience. It quietly shapes your mind, your choices, and even your reality. The moment you see the strings, you stop being a pawn and start becoming untouchable. If you want to see the world the elite don't want you to see, hit subscribe, share this with someone who needs to wake up, and turn on notifications. Knowledge is power, and it's time to take yours.